We have been talking about the different perspectives on national security and military cooperation that has to do with a new perspective on homeland defense and homeland security. For this keynote speaker, I have the honor to introduce on behalf of the organizers, Davey Heyman from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Davey Headman is the Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Previously, he served as a Senior Fellow and Director of the Homeland Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he led the CSIS research and program activities in Homeland Security, focusing on developing the strategies and policies to help build and transform U.S. federal, state, local, and private sector homeland security institutions. Heyman is an expert on terrorism, critical infrastructure protection, bioterrorism. He has a remarkable experience also in the academia. He's a adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and international experience as well. He's the author of several books. And please help me to welcome Mr. Heyman.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome and introduction. And thank you also for the opportunity and invitation to speak here. I was thinking as I was coming over here, trilateral security, trilateral cooperation, what is it that America really has at its core a dynamic with Canada and with Mexico? What is the sort of essence of it? And it dawned on me that in the last year or so, we've lost both to Mexico and Canada in some of the most important sporting events that make a difference to us. World Cup coming up this year. Maybe we'll get another chance with Mexico, and maybe we'll get a chance in 4 years again with hockey. I'm delighted to be here. One of the things that noted in my introduction is I'm the head of policy for the Department of Homeland Security. And what does that mean? So the Office of Policy is in effect the Secretary's think tank. So I come from the world of think tanks to go into more of a government version of the think tank, and I feel very much at home here, returning to that world. So I hope I can indulge you in some thoughts. As a think tanker and one who leads the office in the Homeland Security Department, our job is really first and foremost to envision the world as it ought to be and to try to say how to do that. We have to anticipate the future, and we have to face it. And so it's from that perspective that I engage you today. There is no doubt for any of us in the room and those who work on the issues that we are discussing today, that the United States, Canada, and Mexico share multiple common interests in security, in prosperity, in public safety, and in resiliency of our communities and society. Even at the same time, we also face unique challenges. I think we value these types of discussions because it gives us a chance to take pause and step back from the day-to-day engagement on specific and difficult tactical issues, and to think more broadly and more critically how our mutual interests can and should intersect in the road and pathway ahead. North America is absolutely becoming more integrated. I've said this before in about 10 different speeches over the last 10 years, but I say it even more so today. 7,500 miles in total, with lawful trade exceeding over $500 billion in goods and services per year. We have legal border crossings surpassing 300 million people per year. And so you see the interconnections and interdependencies are growing, from shared electrical grids to jointly operated dams, seamlessly linked oil and gas pipelines, and other such infrastructures. This integration, these interconnections and interdependencies are so significant in my view, and they affect so many spheres of policy and engage such a broad set of constituencies and actors to include all of the dozens of cross-border shared communities, that trilateral relations more resembles, in my view, a hybrid of domestic politics and homeland security than perhaps classic international affairs. In fact, we, amongst those of us in the policy office, and perhaps maybe this will grow bigger, but in our little world, we are fond of referring to the fusion of international security, I should say on international security and on domestic affairs, which is a result of all these connections. We refer to that fondly between Canada and Mexico as intermestic, some new hybrid of domestic affairs and international affairs. And with shared communities at the border, shared infrastructure, and from a homeland security perspective, in many regards, our relationship is really this sort of hybrid of international and domestic affairs. So what I want to do today is to challenge all of us to think about how we might look over the horizon a bit of U.S., Mexico, and Canada and our relationship from maybe an intermestic perspective. What could it be? How might we move to get there? As a background and context to this, I want to also discuss something we did at the department for the first time ever, and that's we completed the first ever Quadrennial Homeland Security Review. This was a requirement of the 9/11 implementing recommendations, the Commission Act from 2007. And the purpose of this review was to outline the strategic framework to guide the vast number of actors from federal, local, and state to private sector, the vast actors in Homeland Security towards a common end. And in fact, the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review has come about, I would say, amongst much expectation and anticipation. What have we learned in the last 7 or 8 years? Well, we've learned a lot. And there are a number of insights that I think this report elaborates on. I commend it to you if you haven't seen it, www.dhs.gov/QHSR. That's for the web out there. I'd like to discuss two, I think, important insights that are relevant to our thinking about trilateral relationship. First is the notion of foundations. As we were thinking about Homeland Security, there was a question about what is the essence. And we spent a lot of time with senior leadership debating and discussing what is Homeland Security, what have we learned, what do we know, partly because it's a new concept, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my second insight. But first, the QHSR defines as a new vision that our nation in the United States have as its vision a homeland that is safe, secure, and resilient against terrorism and other hazards, where American interests, aspirations, and way of life can thrive. And to accomplish this, we put forward 3 concepts that form, as I say, the foundation for our approach to Homeland Security. They are security, resilience, customs, and exchange. These are the 3 things that are at the heart of ensuring that we accomplish what it takes to secure the homeland. Security is that we have to protect the United States, its people, vital interests, and way of life. Resilience, that individuals, communities, and systems that sustain us must be robust. They must be able to adapt, and they must be able to rapidly recover in the face of adversity and in crisis. And customs and exchange. This is the idea that this goes back to the historic view of borders and borders exchanges, that interchange in the world really matters. And so we must expedite and enforce the lawful trade, travel, and immigration that sustains our daily lives. And what's important to recognize about these foundations, and why I bring them up, is that there is a trilateral relationship. That is to say, all of these must come together in tension, but perhaps in cooperation, if we are to succeed in accomplishing Homeland Security. Second insight is that in the QHSR, we illuminate perhaps some of the brilliance and challenge of let's call it the invention of Homeland Security. Remember, it is a relatively new concept prior to the last decade. And I think it's still relatively new. What's important, I think, to recognize is that also national security, and even perhaps international security as concepts, were relatively new at one time or another. National security comes about in the 1930s from the academic community, and it was only formally established with the National Security Act of 1947, which brought together the Department of War and the Department of Navy into a single integrated entity. But it did more than that. It created the National Security Council, it created what's now the National Security Advisor, and it brought together previously discrete, let's call it bureaucratic or intellectual concepts having to do with foreign affairs and military policy, integrating them into a single concept called national security. The concept of Homeland Security, in fact, does something similar. If the 2002 Homeland Security Act, we actually formalize or introduce this notion of Homeland Security, which creates the Department of Homeland Security and the Homeland Security Council, and brings in a third concept to the historic notion of national security. We bring in not just military policy and foreign affairs, but domestic policy and domestic security concerns. So we have now the notion of Homeland Security has another trilateral relationship between military, foreign affairs, and domestic security interests. And so what we have now evolved is this notion of Homeland Security that describes the intersection of dealing with threats and hazards from traditional government and civic responsibilities of defense, but now also emergency response and law enforcement, border control, and immigration. And what I think the insight here is what's important for us to recognize, at least as I think about the trilateral security relationship, is that as we are in the process of thinking anew about Homeland Security, it is timely to think about our relationship amongst our closest neighbors as well, and that it requires that same type of flexibility of thinking regarding historically and even perhaps bureaucratically discrete entities. Let me put this in the North American context. The need for international partnership is no greater than with our North American partners, with Canada and Mexico. Indeed, the term international does not fit well when speaking of these friends and neighbors, particularly given the closeness of our economies, of our communities, the deep link between our shared cultures and societal and security interests. DHS efforts, our department efforts with both Canada and Mexico, span all of these realms, ranging from aviation security to cargo security to maritime and law enforcement, intelligence and infrastructure protection, emergency preparedness, all of these things, including to counter terrorism. The importance of the North American connection can be seen not just at the community level where we live it, but also at the political level, at our leadership level, from the annual North American Leaders Summit to the regular engagement we have amongst our cabinet agencies and secretaries. Secretary Napolitano, for example, has committed to, and we are now engaged in biannual meetings with the Canadian Minister of Public Safety, who she had the pleasure of watching the American-Canadian hockey game with at the closing ceremonies. But let's not dwell on this. And also now meets annually with the Ministers of Citizen Immigration Canada, Transport Canada. And she met with Prime Minister Harper last May in Ottawa. Similarly, Secretary has met with President Calderon about 3 weeks ago, I believe it was, and has already met this year with the Mexican Secretaries of Public Security, Foreign Relations, and Interior. So it's important that both at the leadership level and the community level, we are, in fact, have deep connections. Of course, the connections and the engagement is broader than meetings and statements at the political, of the political interests. From our point of view, we have, for example, the ICE-led, our Immigration and Customs Enforcement-led Border Enforcement Security Task Force, which operate on the southwest and northern borders, to the multi-agency integrated border enforcement teams, to the Coast Guard's Shipwriter program on the northern border, where DHS personnel are literally working side by side their Canadian counterparts and their Mexican counterparts on the south border on a daily basis. Furthermore, I think that the United States, Canada, and Mexico are working not only from a perspective of a North American interest amongst our communities, but broader in our interest in the world. We are, in many regards, equally interested and have worked collaboratively in assistance in Haiti after the earthquake, deploying troops in Afghanistan, and in the case of U.S. and Canada, and in the case, of Mexico and Central America, looking at transnational criminal groups and gangs. The question I guess I would like to ask is, and I've heard from those of you who have come up to me as I got here, discussions of continental engagement, North American security perimeters, questions about that. What of that? What does it mean? What does it mean of trilateral security? I remind you all that it is equally important that we continue to focus on bilateral, not just trilateral. That, as in any neighborhood, we have varied degrees of relationships with our friends and neighbors, and we continue to do so internationally. But as we think about the threats and challenges we face from a continental perspective, I think it's fair to say that the trilateral relationship has grown and it needs to continue to grow. H1N1 is a perfect example of this. Once the virus entered North America, it would have been nearly impossible to confine it to one country. In fact, in response to that outbreak, the United States, Canada, and Mexico implemented a number of elements of a North American plan which called for a continental approach to fighting pandemic flu. And all three of our countries shared broadly, from laboratory specimens to antivirals to advice and recommendations and risk communication strategies. In fact, Mexico hosted a very successful trilateral summit in October 2009 to further our cooperative responses. The security challenges with continental implications are many and varied, from preventing terrorist acts and weapons of mass destruction to stemming and stopping transnational criminal activity and responding to natural disasters and threats to our own health. These threats are transborder and transnational, and this is, of course, my central point. The trilateral relationship, and I might add, from my perspective, Homeland Security, it's not just about security, it's about economic growth and prosperity and the strength of North America in the global economy. It is bigger than any one of us, but it is shared by all of us. So what might a trilateral relationship look like? The question is one that I pose to all of us. I believe it is one that enhances our mutual security and not only facilitates but expedites our legitimate trade and travel and engagement with the rest of the world, bringing together the three foundations that we view are fundamental to Homeland Security, but also to security writ large: security, resilience, and interchange with the world. So this is the challenge I put to all of us. And as we ponder it, let me put forward this question. The question really comes to one that has been asked for a number of years and probably been answered a number of years, but I ask it again. What do the borders mean to us? What are borders when we talk about North American interests and continental security? For one thing, they mean many different things. Borders are, for those who live on them, are shared communities amongst families and friends. They are also, as I mentioned earlier, shared infrastructures that transcend a common line of definition. But they are also a place by which we receive and transport those goods and services that sustain our daily lives. And as such, one of the additional insights from our quadrennial review is that the importance of securing and managing our borders is more than securing and managing a line in the sand, but in ensuring and safeguarding the lawful flow of goods and services that sustain our lives. And as such, we think about that, and we think about the $500 billion of trade and the 300 million individuals that travel across our borders, and we ask ourselves, all of these things that are flow into and out of our continental region that sustain us, what is our trilateral interest in securing and ensuring and safeguarding lawful flows of people, goods, and services? It's my view that as we refocus our traditional views of borders to this broader concept, to looking perhaps outside of our own borders, as it were. If we refocus our efforts on preventing dangerous goods and people from entering the lawful stream of travel and commerce, in other words, in securing flows that come to North America, we in many ways, in regard, are addressing the fundamental interests of all of us. And so it is something that I think I would put forward to this group at looking for a path towards how we can do this more. There are challenges. There is no doubt that we have a complex relationship and that the day-to-day operations at our border must continue to grow. But what I would like to leave you with is this notion that, first of all, the Department of Homeland Security is committed to exploring these ideas and to expanding our cooperation, particularly since one of our central missions is this notion of securing borders. But to tie this together, if we go back to the notion of Homeland Security and the idea that we bring together in one concept domestic and international, foreign and civil and military, federal and local, if we take this notion that we have shared communities and shared infrastructure and shared interest in the securing of the flows that come and sustain us, I think it is my conclusion that we also share in many ways in North America a common future that will depend upon us defining, understanding, and working together towards whatever it means to be intermestic. And I look forward to building that with all of you together. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heyman. There's some space for some questions. Andrew, please.
Great. Andrew Seeley from the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks for your comments. It seems that one of the shifts at Homeland Security has been, initially when Homeland Security was created, it was a question of really securing borders first. It seems there's been a shift in the past couple of years, and certainly under this administration, towards thinking about secure flows and smart borders. And we've talked about that for a while, but increasingly we have the technology, the ability, the intelligence to move towards this. And particularly with Canada and Mexico, that makes a great deal of difference, obviously, thinking about not stopping every item that's coming across the border and inspecting it, but trying to figure out before things get to the border how you make sure they're secure, how you use risk management techniques to figure out what needs inspected at the border and what can be inspected before it gets there. Can you tell us your thinking about that?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think I would say shift so much as an evolution of thinking that that we recognize. I think. Look, there's been a number of acts of Congress and initiatives by the department over the years that talked about this notion of pushing borders out, which I don't think is the right idea. But there is a piece of that. There's an element of what that idea had some merits in terms of the idea that there are things that we have to be concerned about that come across our borders that we need to interdict. And the question is this: how do you identify, understand, and interdict, perhaps even investigate and then interdict, threats and as far back towards even the point of origin as you can? Because in fact, we all have an interest in not having to address concerns at the last point, which is either at our borders or inside. And so the evolution of thinking is, number one, that the goods and services and integration and interchange with the world is, first of all, fundamental to Homeland Security. That lawful interchange with the world sustains us and provides us with the economic prosperity and security that our nations seek. But second is that in order for us to safeguard lawful flows that transcend our borders, we should do our best to understand and investigate and interdict them at the earliest possible point. And so with that, you can imagine, and I think this is not something that the United States, this is not just in the United States' interest, this is a shared interest that all countries would have, whether it's for dealing with the trade in illicit goods and contraband, or to more nefarious activities, transnational criminal and possible terrorists. We want, as a family of nations, to be able to protect our communities before they, at the earliest possible point. So the evolution of thinking is to say, how far back can we go working with our partners? And it plays out even more so with Canada and Mexico and the United States because we are one continent. Does that answer you? Yeah.
Any other question? Richard.
Thank you. Richard Downey from the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies. Thank you very much. One of the things that has been discussed, particularly regarding the border, particularly with Mexico, has been that drugs come up into the United States, and what goes back are bulk cash and weapons. And it's in this kind of circular trade. And I wonder if you've had a chance to look at this issue, because there's been an issue, certainly on the part of the Mexicans, saying, you would really help us out if you in the U.S. could ensure that the weapons that are coming from us into Mexico don't flow as briefly. So really, this is an offshoot somewhat of Andrew's question. But have you had a chance to really think through how we might more effectively address this issue of the weapons flow into Mexico?
Absolutely. In fact, we have already taken steps because. So I give you the perspective of flows from a U.S. perspective, but if I was sitting in Mexico, I would be looking at the flows of drugs and money that also need to be understood, investigated, interdicted at the earliest possible point. And the Department of Homeland Security works very closely with the Mexican government, but also on our own, we have stepped up inspections and opportunities to interdict at the border, as well as other operations within the United States to follow those pathways that you've described, understand where the flows are going, and interdict at the appropriate time. And you've seen recently a number of arrests that ICE has done related to bulk cash smuggling and contraband. But that is something that we absolutely have to do, and I was not meaning to look just outside, but particularly in the Continental perspective, it works in both directions.
I'm Steve Kelly, currently from Duke University. I want to ask Andrew's question a third time. And there was a speaker this morning who was asking a question about the fortification of the border, and he generated a vigorous response from a certain general, and I saw him leaving the room with a bloody nose, so he may not be here now. But to the casual observer, if you look at the border, the 600-mile wall, Western Hemisphere travel initiative, sort of the increased number of personnel on the border, are you suggesting that DHS is rethinking that facilitating legitimate trade and travel side? Because I think border crossings are down. There was a story in the paper about how the northwest of the United States didn't see the benefit from the Olympics in Vancouver that they'd expected, perhaps because people were intimidated by crossing the border, sort of on that continuum of facilitating legitimate trade and travel and stopping bad guys and bad stuff. Are you suggesting that in your think tank that's being looked at again and that you're trying to come up with a new solution? Because some observers would say that all you've done is hardened and thickened the border without seeing that bounce back of trade and legitimate trade and travel.
Let's see, very good question. It is a theme that has, it's a theme that I've certainly discussed when I was outside of government, and we've now discussed it inside of government. And it sort of goes as follows. We have exceptional relationships with Canada and Mexico for all the reasons that everyone has talked about, including myself. We also have exceptional security interests amongst us, and we have to have all of those things optimized. And the question is, how do we do that? And what I was trying to do with my remarks today was to tell you at least some of my thinking without making policy here, as it pertains to continental views versus border views. It is, I think, incumbent upon the think tank world and in Canada, in Mexico, and in the United States to ask that very tough question. And it goes in this way from my perspective. How do we better ensure the security and the safeguard of lawful flows of goods, people throughout North America, and thin the border, let's say? Okay, there has been, notably, additional security measures put in place since 9/11 on both sides of both borders from the United States. And the question is, what steps would we need to take to maintain our North American interests, our trilateral interests, without any diminution to security, perhaps even to enhance security? And I've perhaps too obliquely hinted at that in some of my thinking in my remarks. Is that sufficient, or is that too oblique? It's pretty oblique.
Can I take one more question? I have a question, Mr. Heyman. What will be the limits for the cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico and the U.S. and Canada? What are the limits, taking into account the dimension of threats in terms of strategic thinking and policy implementation? I would like to know your reflections about it.
So I'm still thinking of the last question. I'll just sort of briefly say on the limits of cooperation. I guess I haven't done a lot of thinking on the limits because it's my responsibility to think more broadly about what it takes to get things done, and so I wouldn't start with what the limits are. We all have, I think the greatest limit we have is our own domestic politics, that we have great mutual interests at the security of our societies and communities and the prosperity. But the challenge are, this is not meant to be any way diminutive of domestic politics, but it is incumbent upon the leadership of our nations to develop vision and to help bring us all together. This gets back to the question, because the question, if we have mutual interests in security, we have also mutual interests in sovereignty, and we actually have mutual interests in expediting trade and travel across our borders to the extent, to as much as we can. The real question you all need to answer, in my view, is what steps does it take from a trilateral perspective to have the same security that we're seeking today, but with either different programs to accomplish that? And that's the question I'm asking my team. I think that's the same question everybody should be asking themselves. And I'll give you another hint at what I think works. And that is, for example, the shipwriter program, which I mentioned, which is a very interesting proposition that the Canadian and this actually, we've got similar programs with Mexico, but I'll just bring this one up. You actually have joint operations with the U.S. And Canadian Coast Guard. So in effect, you're looking at shared activity or mutual activity with different authorities that allow for broader activity and intervention. So I think the way to think about this is what ways might we have our shared interests, either through authorities, joint activity, jointness, sharedness, or mutual cooperation that allows us, therefore, to thin the border in some sense, because we are in a time of scarce budgets and scarce funds. So it's an interest both from our good governance and practical implementation of scarce resources, but it's also, there may be ways of thinking about this that actually lead to greater security. So that hopefully answers your question, and your question, and your question, and any other question. And I see my Coast Guard friends over there smiling, so I think I answered it. Yes, sir.
I want to thank, again, I want to thank to Davey Bate, the Canada Institute, Andrew Seeley from the Mexico Institute, BMI, and of course, thanks to you, sir.
Thank you all.
Just on behalf of General P, BMI Institute, Wilson Center, I'd like to
Oh, you're very kind.
thank you again for coming.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.